A small legal shift can carry huge consequences when it happens at the edge of a map. Someone can leave home believing they are fully within the rules, with paperwork or a status that is treated as valid where they started, and then discover that crossing into the next jurisdiction changes how the exact same conduct is categorized. The behavior may be identical, but the legal meaning attached to it can flip because a different recognition system takes over. That is the less visible side of many constitutional debates. Not grand slogans, but the operational standards that decide what counts as lawful, what counts as proof, and how officials are expected to respond when they encounter a person who claims lawful status. H.R. 38 is presented as an attempt to reduce that border-by-border instability during interstate travel by moving away from a patchwork of state-by-state recognition toward a more uniform rule for how lawful concealed carry is treated when people cross state lines. The focus here is strictly educational. The goal is to understand what the proposal is intended to change for people trying to remain compliant, while moving through multiple jurisdictions, and to see how legal standards, burdens, and interpretive choices quietly determine real outcomes. As described, H.R. 38 is framed less as a plan to overhaul each state's permitting system and more as a recognition rule aimed at travel. The central idea is that if one state has already issued a concealed carry permit to a person who is legally eligible, that authorization should not automatically become pointless the moment the person enters another state that allows concealed carry, but, under current arrangements, declines to recognize that out-of-state permit. Supporters argue that the current landscape can create severe consequences, driven mainly by geography, because the same individual can be lawful at home and still face serious legal exposure elsewhere even without changing conduct. H.R. 38, in this presentation, would establish a national recognition principle so that a valid permit from one state is treated as valid in other states that permit concealed carry, lowering the risk that a traveler becomes a criminal by crossing a line rather than by doing something different. The driver AS license analogy is used to explain the logic. States can keep their own licensing standards, but they generally honor each other's credentials, so ordinary interstate movement remains workable. A useful way to study the argument is to keep the two layers separate in your mind. One layer is a state's authority to decide how it issues permits, and the other layer is a proposed obligation to respect authorization granted by another state during travel. An educational checkpoint fits naturally here. Taking a moment to restate that two-layer structure in your own words helps track the core claim without drifting into assumptions that are not in the framing. And a second pivot follows from that separation. If H.R. 38 is about recognition rather than redesign, then the next question becomes what it would mean in day-to-day situations where uncertainty about recognition drives enforcement decisions and legal risk. That practical problem is portrayed as more than theoretical, because the current reciprocity environment can be hard to navigate even for careful people who are trying to comply. The script describes travelers poring over reciprocity maps, reading statutes, and planning routes around strict jurisdictions, yet still being vulnerable because compliance can be fragile in real life. A missed exit, a detour, or an unexpected overnight stop can land someone in a place that refuses to treat their authorization as valid, turning a trip into a legal emergency even though the traveler did not set out to break rules. H.R. 38 is presented as reducing the need for constant recalculation by letting travelers rely on home state authorization across the trip, rather than treating each segment of the route as a new legal puzzle that must be solved again. Employment-based travel is emphasized as a particularly clear example, especially for commercial drivers who cross state lines as part of their job and may not be able to choose the most legally convenient path. The script names truck drivers David McCoy and Jeffrey Johnson as examples used to illustrate how this patchwork can place working people in a vulnerable position. They reportedly had valid permits from their home states, yet faced legal trouble when traveling through jurisdictions that did not recognize those permits. This is a key, what's really at stake moment, because it highlights how the governing standard, whether an out-of-state permit counts as meaningful evidence or as a relevant paper, can reshape outcomes without any change in intent or behavior. Another educational pause can be helpful here. Noting exactly which part of the story is about recognition rules and which part is about personal conduct helps keep the reasoning chain clear. The script also connects the issue to the growth of constitutional carry, describing that more than half of U.S. states allow law-abiding adults to carry concealed firearms without obtaining a permit. In that environment, some residents do not hold permits at all because their home states do not require them, but they may travel into states that still demand a permit. The dilemma described is that people may feel pressure to get a permit they do not need at home simply to reduce risk elsewhere, while those who do not obtain one can face severe consequences in states with different requirements, even if they are otherwise eligible and acting responsibly. In the script's telling, that mismatch has contributed to arrests, felony charges, and long legal disputes, for people who believed they were acting responsibly but crossed into jurisdictions that treated their home status as meaningless. From there, the script shifts toward how legal standards play out during everyday interactions, especially routine encounters with law enforcement. Traffic stops are portrayed as a point where differences in state rules and unfamiliar documentation can become decisive. The concern described is not only what the written rules say, but how they are understood and applied in real time, particularly if an officer is unfamiliar with an out-of-state permit or uncertain about local recognition rules. The script claims that in some situations, officers have refused to recognize out-of-state permits, leading to extended detentions or arrests driven largely by confusion rather than evidence of unlawful conduct. H.R. 38 is framed as narrowing the room for discretionary decisions that effectively treat unfamiliar as invalid. Under the described approach, a valid permit would have to be accepted as legitimate evidence of lawful carry, and escalation would need to be grounded in actual probable cause rather than uncertainty or subjective interpretation. This is another natural educational CTA moment, tracking the role of probable cause as a gatekeeping standard, separating decisions based on concrete facts from decisions based mainly on misunderstanding, helps clarify why the script treats procedure as a core issue rather than a side detail. The script then extends the analysis into what happens after an arrest or charge, arguing that out-of-state permit holders can end up, in practical terms, having to prove innocence by producing documents, hiring counsel, and fighting allegations that were tied more to geography than behavior. H.R. 38 is presented as shifting that burden back toward what the script associates with criminal prosecution. The government bears the responsibility to prove unlawful conduct beyond a reasonable doubt, rather than treating a person as presumptively guilty because their lawful status came from somewhere else. The script uses Shanine Allen as an illustration of why that burden allocation matters, describing her as legally permitted to carry in her home state but arrested during a routine stop in another state, then spending weeks in jail while facing severe penalties. As the argument is presented, H.R. 38 would have required the state to show she was actually outside the law, rather than treating portable lawful status as inherently suspicious. Another pivot follows naturally, once the issue is framed as not only personal hardship, but also institutional process. The next question becomes whether the proposal includes mechanisms to reduce mistakes and address the costs when errors occur. In that next step, the script describes an accountability feature aimed at the downstream costs of wrongful arrests and charges. The point is that even if charges are later dropped, the damage can linger through legal bills, job disruption, and reputational harm. H.R. 38 is described as including a provision that can shift financial responsibility to the agency involved, requiring that government entity to cover legal costs and related expenses when someone is detained or charged despite carrying lawfully under the recognition rule. This is presented as more than compensation. It is also described as a structural incentive that treats enforcement mistakes as institutional costs rather than private burdens, potentially encouraging better accuracy, training, and consistent procedures. A practical educational CTA fits here as well, noticing how a cost-shifting rule can influence behavior without changing the underlying prohibition helps connect legal design to real-world incentives. The script also introduces what it calls a felony trap, meaning a system where someone can start a trip legally and become a felon simply by entering a stricter state, even when the conduct never changes and any noncompliance could be accidental rather than deliberate. It notes that attorneys general from multiple states have criticized this type of patchwork exposure, describing it as destabilizing when serious criminal liability can hinge on an invisible line on a map. H.R. 38 is portrayed as trying to reduce that trap by keeping lawful status lawful during travel, thereby lowering the chance that ordinary movement produces life-altering consequences rooted in confusion. At the same time, the script emphasizes boundaries. It does not describe H.R. 38 as erasing private property rights or turning every location into a lawful carrying space. Property owners and businesses are still described as retaining authority to prohibit firearms on their premises through posted signs or clear policies, and states are described as continuing to designate sensitive locations as off-limits. The message is that the proposal aims at clarity and consistency in one specific layer, interstate recognition, without claiming that all restrictions disappear. Another boundary is drawn between state recognition rules and federal restrictions, with the script emphasizing that H.R. 38 does not alter federal law. Federal buildings such as post offices and courthouses are described as remaining prohibited locations under existing federal rules, and the script states that federal school zone statutes are not affected. An additional educational CTA can land naturally at this point by focusing attention on layered compliance. Keeping track of how a single reform can simplify one layer while leaving other layers intact helps prevent overgeneralizing what the proposal is supposed to do. The script then returns to the theme of state sovereignty, repeating that states keep their own standards for permits, training, and eligibility, while the proposal focuses on mutual recognition among states that allow concealed carry, even if the receiving state would have required different conditions for its own residents. Supporters describe this as balancing local control with national consistency. States remain different, but those differences are less able to create sudden, unpredictable legal jeopardy for people trying to follow the law while traveling. In its closing frame, the script places H.R. 38 in a broader constitutional and historical context. By referencing late 19th century laws described as protecting the right to carry while traveling, and linking that to the idea that self-defense concerns can increase during travel. It also notes modern Supreme Court decisions described as treating the right to carry for self-defense as fundamental but not unlimited. And it mentions that modern jurisprudence has recognized restrictions for individuals who pose credible threats, drawing a line between law-abiding citizens and genuinely dangerous conduct. H.R. 38 is characterized as fitting within that distinction by aiming to protect responsible carriers while leaving public safety measures aimed at dangerous behavior intact. The final hook in this framework is quiet but significant. When legal debates feel abstract, the decisive contest is often over standards, recognition rules, probable cause, burdens of proof, and accountability mechanisms, because those details determine whether lawful status is stable or geographically fragile. Seen through that lens, the larger educational takeaway is that predictability in law depends not on slogans, but on how interpretation, procedural gates, and evidentiary assumptions are built into the system and applied in practice.